In this video, we're going to take the exported out pipe assets, load them into Substance Painter, and paint them in a variety of different ways to create several different assets we can use in Unity. Let's start by going to File and New. We're going to be using the PBR template. I'm going to use a resolution of 2048, but remember you can use any resolution that's compatible with the hardware you're working on. So if it's too high, feel free to use 1024 or 512. Normal map format, I'm going to choose OpenGL. File format, I'm going to select, and I'm going to go to Pipe 2. I'm not going to be using auto unwrapping because I think we did a pretty good job on our own inside of Blender. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And I'm going to hit F2 so I can look at my perspective view. And everything looks all right. So why don't we go ahead and bake this object? Your layout may be different than mine, but all of the different panels you see here are pretty much entrenched in this side area over here. If we come over to Texture Set Settings, what we'll see is that we have our current workings resolution, which is 2048. This is where you can lower that down to something that works with your system in case you have any slowdown. Below that are our channels. Here we have base color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal. I'm going to go ahead and click on this plus and add an ambient occlusion as well. I'm going to come over here and take a look at our texture set list. And what you'll notice is that it's called default material. Now I did not create a material and give it a proper name. Why don't we go ahead and do that here? I'm going to double click on it and I'm going to call this pipe _2 _M. Coming back over to texture set settings, we are then going to come down to Bake Mesh Maps. What you'll notice is that these are empty at the moment. It's up to us to populate them either with maps generated by some external program or by clicking on the Bake Mesh Maps button. Here we can choose our output size. For right now, we're just trying to get a sense of whether or not our asset is properly created. So we're actually not going to tweak anything just yet. All I'm going to do is hit Bake Selected Textures. We're going to let this process finish. Hit OK, and take a look at your object. Hit the B key or select this drop down and go to the different mesh maps. All we're trying to do is iterate through them and see whether or not there's any strange details. Many times if you have overlapping UVs or you have strange geometry problems, it will become present as weird visual artifacts. I'm going to hit M to go back to material mode. Things look all right, so now I'm going to go back and click Bake Mesh Maps. Now we can get a little bit more serious with the quality of our bakes. I'm going to go ahead and increase this to 1024. Usually I like to keep either lockstep with my resolution or one below it. Here we have our high poly parameters. With this pipe, we had created a high poly version of it in order for us to get better rounded surfaces. We can choose our high definition meshes here. Select this, and I will go to Pipe 2 High. Further down, you'll notice different settings. And these settings correspond to how it's going to sample that high poly object. The first one is Use Cage. What you can do, and we might do this in case we run into any problems, is take your original low poly mesh, and the reason why a cage might be necessary is if you have complicated geometry winding back and forth, different concave surfaces, many times a cage is going to define how it should sample that object better than these sliders below. Below this you'll see a max frontal distance and a max rear distance. This is how far the vector that samples the high poly object should travel before it basically gives up. If these values are too high, they could sample other parts of the geometry it didn't intend to sample. If they're too low, it may sample nothing, and then you won't get any kind of information on that part of the surface. Another important one is our anti-aliasing. For right now, I'll just set this to 2, but when I do our final bake, I'll crank that up to 8x8. Let's go ahead and hit Bake Selected Textures. I'm going to hit OK. And if we zoom in, what we're going to be looking for are strange or weird artifacts on the surface. So what you'll notice is something going on right here. And this has to do with the high poly version. We have a similar effect down here on the sides. One way we can fix this is by going back into Blender, selecting our pipe. Let's hide the bend for now. And here you can see the difference where the size of this pipe compared to the size of the polygonal pipe is pretty large. We could manipulate the low poly version, or what I'm going to do actually is select low poly version. What I want to do is get rid of my normal information. The reason is because the high quality version will be projecting that information onto the surface for me. So coming down over here, auto smooth, we could either crank this up severely so that everything is smooth, or we could just turn this off, for instance. We could go to Object and Smooth Shade. If we export this object out now by going to File, Export, FBX, and once again choosing Pipe 2, letting that happen, we'll come back in here, and what I wanted to pay attention to is this hard edge right here. Let's go to Edit, Project Configuration, Select, choose Pipe 2, keep everything else the same, and hit OK. Now I did make one mistake, and that's I exported everything out. So let's go back over here, select the object, File, Export, FBX. I'm going to choose Selected Objects and choose Pipe 2. Once again, come back over here, go to Edit, Project Configuration, select Pipe 2, hit OK, and there we are. So let's do a rebake and see if we get something a little bit better. So Texture Set Settings, Bake Mesh Maps, hit Bake Selected, and hit OK. And there we are. By not having that hard edge there, the illusion is a little bit better. So now we can do our final high quality bake. Go ahead and click Bake Mesh Maps, scroll on down. I'm going to turn anti-aliasing up to 8x8, and I'm going to hit Bake Selected. Great. Once again, feel free to hit B on your keyboard just to do a sanity check that things are looking somewhat acceptable. Now we can begin painting. I can close the Texture Set Settings window. I probably won't be needing that for a while. I'm going to go ahead and delete that first paint layer because I know I'm going to want to work with the fill layer. And since this is a pipe, I'm probably going to want something that has to do with paint. So let's just do a quick search for paint, and we see a number of different options. However, let's also look for metal, because underneath the paint, the object is probably going to be some sort of a metal. I'm going to click on cast iron and drag it into the layers panel. This will create a fill layer, which means the entire object is filled with this. If we want to restrict what elements are cast iron, we would need to use a mask by clicking here or right-clicking and choosing a white mask or a black mask. I'm going to go over here to UV projection, and I'm going to choose triplanar to see what that looks like instead. Triplanar, as the name says, comes at this object from multiple directions. Now, as soon as I did triplanar, I'm noticing I have some strange issues right here across this object. You can see here, we're sort of getting a blurring between the two. Now, this is a good time to take a look at what our UVs look like by hitting F3. And here you'll notice that strange seam coming over here. Now, this most likely has to do with those normals on the surface. One thing we could try is adjusting the hardness value, which you'll see adjusts how hard the projections come together. If you crank this up, you'll notice that you get a better projection. Now, another reason we could be having this issue is just due to the layout itself. Perhaps I didn't lay it out as well as I thought. Either way, what I do recommend is you play with it first. Click and drag and manipulate this object to see whether or not these artifacts disappear. If they do easily disappear, it's probably not your UVs. In this case, UV projection is probably going to be the better one for me to work with. Now, you may end up with a slight seam along the bottom, in which case there's really nothing stopping you from duplicating that layer by hitting Ctrl D and changing this to a different type like triplanar projection, which has far fewer seams across this bottom element. Then, of course, we can right-click, add a black mask, and then we can try to paint this detail back in by applying white to this surface here. So for this layer, I'm going to come over here, and we can begin seeing if any of these values are actually causing issues in our object. Let's go ahead and rotate this object and see whether or not, that is by object, I actually mean the texture itself. And we are going to, of course, see whether or not we get any changes. Let's turn this back on white for now so we can see what's happening. And I'm going to turn off the layer underneath of it. And you know what? That looks really great. Nothing of issue there. So I'll turn on this underlying layer. And what I want to do is I want this layer to paint on top. So I'm going to turn this black, and I'm going to choose a brush from my shelf down here. Let's go to brushes. And I really just want something interesting. I don't want to use a too uniform brush. You know, this one might be good. And the idea now is I can interactively change the size of my mouse by, well, one, either coming over here to the properties panel and adjusting it here, or holding down Control and either right mouse clicking or left mouse clicking and moving in a horizontal or vertical direction to change things like size, fill rate, rotation, and other parameters. Once you've got something you think is okay, go ahead, scroll on down to the bottom and choose the color. Since I want this to be painted on, that is opaque, I'm going to be using a white color. However, I'm going to lower that stroke opacity a bit. I want it to build up on the surface gradually so it looks a little bit more natural. As you can see here, as I paint, I'm slowly working to get rid of some of these transition pieces that are not quite seamless. So, there we go. Especially up here too. Now, one thing I also want to do is I want to go and click on this drop-down box in the upper left-hand corner of the layers. This allows you to move between height, roughness, metallic, or normal when you're making changes. If you need to see them in the viewport, hit the C key for channel and you'll be able to move through them, or click here and interactively see it. In this case, we can see the mask that I'm working on, and we can see how it's actually building up as I use this. And here I can just go in here and arbitrarily start to paint in a little bit more onto the surface here. Especially in those areas in the center where I'm quite certain I want this to completely disappear. Now that I've done that, come back over here, you'll notice that some information might be creeping through, like height information or vector information. One way to solve this is by clicking on base layer, going to normal, and changing the blend mode. For height maps and normal maps, the idea is to additively blend information with it. The idea is to additively add this information or multiply it or some other algorithm. It's going to be taking the destination, what was already there, and the source, which is our current layer, and blending them in some way. I'm going to change this from NMDT, that is normal map detail, to just normal. And I'm going to do the same thing now for height information. I'm going to come here, and I'm going to say normal as well. Now I am replacing the height in the normal data with what is on that layer, and I'm not additively blending them together instead. And of course, if we saw other possible problem areas, there's nothing stopping us from coming here and painting on that triplanar layer, which, depending upon the orientation you set it up, may look better by doing something like this. Now, you've got a lot of interesting features. One thing you might want to consider is whether or not the scale makes sense. I might bump this scale up to a layer of 2, for instance, and I might come to this one as well and just increase that scale as well. Now, it is a bit intense, so I might go to the cast iron, open the technical parameters, and lower the normal intensity just a little bit. Or, if there's no normal information, as you see here, although I did just turn it on, we can dial that back a little bit. We can go to height range, and by decreasing the range, there's fewer values it can take on. In this case, dialing back that parameter reduced a lot of the detail we see on the surface. And then once again, just coming in and painting anywhere where you want to. Now I need to paint on some sort of interesting information on the surface of this. So let's go back to materials again. And this time I'm going to either look for paint or plastic or something similar to that. Here we have steel painted. If I click and drag this and bring it up to the top, I'm going to move back to base color. You can see we have a sort of painted layer. Now opening up painted, you'll see we have the color. And while this color is okay, I'm thinking either maybe a bright white pipe, or maybe making several alternate versions, maybe a green or a red and so forth. For right now, let's go to blue and pick a more grayish blue tone. We can go in the technical parameters and of course modify anything we see there. But what I really want to do is add a mask to this object. I'm going to right click on here and I'm going to make a black mask. And I would like to maybe put some designs or words indicating flow or other generic information. If we come over to alphas and then we choose something, let's say this double arrow right here, and we're on our brush. What you'll notice is we're on the mask. That's important. We're not on the fill layer, we're on the mask. Coming down here, I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a paint layer. I'm going to go to stroke opacity, make that 100%. Now, one thing I'm not liking is that this steel painted layer is not stopping the bumps and crevices and cracks. So once again, I am going to turn on normal for this. I'm going to come over to normal map, and I'm going to change that to replace or normal. I'm going to do the same thing for the height layer now. Click here, hit normal as well. And now we can begin additively putting in additional information. So here I have an alpha selected there, and I have my grayscale value, and I'm going to choose, let's go with 100% white. Now sometimes I like to work in orthographic mode, so I'll hit F6 and hit F to frame up and come at this from the side. If you hold the shift button down as you rotate, it'll lock you to whatever view you rotate towards. And then now we can come in with our double arrow, scale that up, maybe rotate it as well. And if you need an exact value, you can always come over to the brush information and we can change things such as, well, we don't need any of the sizes, flows, or angles to jitter at this point, so that's fine. But more importantly, we can make this angle exactly 180 degrees. And then we can come in here and just paint on our detail, as you see right there. Now, I actually don't like this. I do want to add nice accents like that, but I almost want it to be another layer on top of everything. Instead, what I think I'm going to do is add a white mask first and have this cover just about everything in the scene. Then what I'm going to do is go over to my smart masks. The smart masks allow you to create a mask based upon usually properties of the geometry from the baked mesh maps. So if we take a look here, White, of course, means opaque. Black means it's going to disappear. And we can see which one of these makes sense. Now, for a pipe, the paint's probably going to be mostly everywhere, except in a few small spots where it's been scratched. So here we have one called paint damaged. We can drag and drop that here, and you can see what's going on. Now this is pretty intense, but there's nothing stopping us from clicking on these different layers and adjusting things like the amount of wear, or how contrasted it is, which means it's going to not blend as easily usually. We can also change how grungy it is, or the scale of those, because right there the scale looks a little large. And once again, come in here and make any changes we wish. Here we have curvature weighting, which means that areas where there's curvature, if we crank this up, it will remove, and if there's ambient occlusion, we can also do a similar effect. So here with edge smoothness, we can also see how it impacts these areas. Now that's a lot of random paint removed from sections that, well, I don't think should be removed. So if I come back up here and I right click, we can add another paint level, for instance. And we can choose a brush. So coming over to brushes again and choosing something. Let's go with this one again. I can scale this up. We can choose an opacity that's not quite 100%. And we can come over here. You'll notice my spacing isn't very high. But the idea is, and actually let's hold down Alt and click on this mask layer so we get to see the results. Select our paint layer and just paint out anything that's kind of intense. We do want a little bit, but not so much that it takes away from, well, the fact that other parts of this should be messed up. So I'm going to hit M to come back here. And there we can see a lot more gradual. Rotate the light source around if you don't like where it is. And just take a look at it. I'm going to hit F5 to go back to a standard perspective view. That's very basic. So what's up next? Well, let's go ahead and add some of that stuff we liked before. I'm going to take my steel painted layer. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that layer now. And I'm going to name this paint. I'm going to select the layer. I'm going to choose the paint color this time to be, let's go with white for right now. Or at least something close to white, but not quite perfect white. Then we're going to go back to our alphas. And once again, now we can have some fun. We can figure out where we're going to paint these different parts. So hit F and zoom in. And if we go down to one of these text objects, pick a font that works with your world, or try to load in your own. Let's go with this Substance font right here and go to the paint layer. And we have all these paint layers. We actually don't want any of these, so let's get rid of them. All we want is this paint right here. And let's once again, I'm going to double click on Substance. We can see we have a strange orientation. I'm going to turn off all of my jittering this time. My angle will be 0 degrees and everything else looks fine. The only thing we might want to adjust is what it says. So instead of saying Substance, we could always say warning. Or since this pipe is more predominantly gray or silver, we could just call this wastewater, something like that, or gray water, depending upon where you're from. And you'll notice that this is a little bit large for the size of our thing. If we were to actually paint on this, and what we really want to do is invert this, so I'm going to add a black mask, and then we could always scale it up. But if we can't get quite the right size, we always can change the size space. We could choose viewport. You'll notice we can get quite a bit larger. Or we can choose the texture itself, and then we get an absolutely massive version. And here's type. I'm going to try bold. And let's actually, maybe we should take a look at this one instead. I think this one looks pretty nice. So let's choose wastewater. Put this, make that a little bit tinier. There we go, since we changed the wording. And we could just stamp wastewater right there. Now you'll notice it popped up on the other side. It went through the object to the other side. There are a couple ways to handle this, but really with how simply we're working here, the fastest and easiest thing to do is probably just going to be to come over here, choose any other object, right? Choose black and just paint it out, increasing our stroke opacity here. There we are. And you can see it's just fine over here. So this is a pipe that says wastewater. Maybe we should create a couple different variations of this texture. I did lose a lot of information from the cast iron layer. So I'm thinking I'm going to go back to the steel painted, go to normal, and instead of doing normal, or if we're going to keep normal, at least let's try just normal map detail, and then I'm going to just crank down on the contribution level for normal. We'll do the same thing for height. We'll come here, we will do detail, and once again, we'll crank that down a bit. Okay. And actually, I'm cranking down the wrong value, if you noticed. What I really want to do is crank down the cast iron. Otherwise, what I need to do is set this to normal, but then just have a standard blending mode being used. In this case, height. If this is set to normal, this is opacity. If we crank this up, we start to lose those features. And we want to pick something, borderline, maybe like around there. Go back to normal as well, and then hit normal, click here, and once again, we can play with that till we get what we like. Or of course, we could have gone to the cast iron layer and just made the effect far more subdued. Completely depends on how you want to work. Now, one thing you might want to consider doing is rather than creating 3D model detail, we could just go to hard surfaces section. And coming over here, we could create our own paint layer. And this layer is only going to contain normal information, so we can turn off everything else. We could, for instance, just choose circle bump right here, right? Drag and drop this into here. And if we move to our object, we can just paint that surface into it. And this can be really great if you need just random bits of detail, like the front of this cap, for instance. You could come here, select this one, scale it up, and just paint a nice little crevice. So now I'm going to export a couple different variations. The idea is the model's the same, but the texture will be different. So we can come up to File and Export. And if you have not already created your own output template, you will need to create one. In the latest versions of Substance Painter, you'll have something along the lines of Unity Universal Render Pipeline, Metallic Standard. What you'll want to do is copy this by duplicating it, clicking this here, and it will create another copy of that. In which case you would then call it something similar to Unity 2019.4.x export, standard, shader, whatever you want. So it looks like it won't let me use dots, so you might want to do something else like this. Standard shader. We can modify this if necessary. Here it's telling you how it's going to output them. It's going to use the mesh name followed by the texture set, which was the name up here, and then it's going to use these words to describe that texture. Usually my meshes and my texture sets share part of the same name to keep them unified as I move from program to program. So I'm actually going to get rid of the $mesh component. And I am going to shorten these down a little bit to just maybe albedo trans, and then usually metallic smoothness to just MS. Normal, you can just do N or norm. And emission, many times I'll just do E by itself. Now we don't have an ambient occlusion layer, so we're going to create that. I'm going to click gray, bring it down here, and I'm going to copy one of these other named sections and paste it here. Instead of E, I'm going to say AO for ambient occlusion. Now I need to tell this program what input map or mesh map or converted maps, which are where there's some math or some function performed on the map before it's exported. Input maps are all the maps coming from the layers. Mesh maps are the ones that we baked, so think of that as baked maps if you want to. We need to figure out which one of these to stick in ambient occlusion, and unfortunately, there's a couple. There's input map ambient occlusion. There is ambient occlusion from the mesh map. If you did it here, it would only be ambient occlusion from the layer stack. If you did it over here, it would only be ambient occlusion from the bake. You want both of these combined. There's two ways of doing that. One is to actually bring the ambient occlusion texture into here as a layer, and that's completely valid. You can do that. Many times I will for certain features. The mesh maps one over here, ambient occlusion, will not listen to any of the layer information here. If we come down here, mixed AO is going to combine the ambient occlusion from the input layers as well as from your bake to create the final one. So I will click and drag this to gray for gray channel. There we are. Looks good. So let's go ahead and go to settings now. We're going to go to our output directory. So typically what I do is I will have a project and I will have a textures folder. And then in here, I will right click, create new, and then I will create a folder for the mesh itself, usually. In this case, this will be pipe_2. Going inside of there, I will create different folders for each export I plan on having. So here, what we can call this is pipe2 underscore, and then, what was this? Gray waste, something descriptive, whatever you want. Gray waste pipe. Well, we already have pipe, so we don't need it again. I'll copy and paste this folder, and we have a gray one. Why don't we have something else? Maybe say a red pipe. So pipe2 underscore red, and what'll this be? Hot water line, something like that. And we'll do one more variation of this. So we'll do cold water line. Or maybe we should do something more interesting. Why don't we do yellow flammable? There we are. So let's go to gray waste pipe and select folder. Here we need to choose the output format, and that's what we just created in output templates. So click on this and scroll up to wherever your named template is. Here's 2019 4x standard shader. Next up is the file type. I would stick with PNG because it's lossless by default. Then the number of bits. If you're working with 16-bit values, you may want to either use 16-bit output or use 8 bits plus dithering. Next up is the texture set size. This can be any size up to 8192. Usually I don't go higher than 4096, and even then those aren't usually used. We'll stick to 2048. And if for some reason that doesn't give you the resolution you need, then you need to go back to your model, splitting it up, multiple UV sets, multiple materials to make it work. So we'll go with 2048 this time. If we click here, we can see a list of exports. If we come over to the list of exports, we get to see the actual final file name. And I already have a problem. The folder I created, I have them with a different name. Textures, pipe2. I want it to mimic these names here, pipe2 underscore gray waste. So let's go back and change my material name. So I'm going to hit save settings. I will come to my texture set settings. What I really want this to be is pipe underscore 2 underscore gray waste. Enter. And actually, one last thing I would like to do is have the paint of wastewater raised a little bit. So going to this layer, technical parameters, going to go to height position, and push that slightly off the surface, just ever so much, to give it a little bit of depth. There we go. Oh, and actually, what am I doing? We should probably add some grit or grime to this before we export it. So let's just type in rust, grab a rust fine. That actually looks really good, the kind of rust you would expect on a steel pipe. I might make this a little bit darker though. And now let's apply some sort of a smart mask to make our life easy to start with. And we've got some edges and scratches, but that's kind of the invert of what I might want. But even if it's the inversion, what we can do is actually apply it. And then if I wanted the opposite, we could just come up here, right click, and of course just do a levels and invert it right there. Now, this is definitely not quite what I want. I almost want, well, not the inversion after all. But rust itself isn't something that kind of just disappears or falls off. It's either there or it's not. So coming to the metal edge properties, if we come in here, we can start to mess with things. Here's the wear level, but really it's the contrast that I want to mess with, because I want them not to fade off, but instead be strong, harsh bits of this stuff all over the place. And another thing I want to is to sink this layer in, because even though technically rust comes kind of out of an object, I think more often than not people think of it as eating away or eroding into the surface. So we're going to just pop it in ever so slightly, okay? And we could change the ordering of these layers. If we didn't want the rust to be on the paint, like it was somewhat new, we could of course do that. And once you get something you like, go to File, Export Textures, do a sanity check, pipe 2 gray waste AO, albedo, emission, MS normal. Let's go to settings, we've got it in the right location, and hit export. Now we can open our output directory, and once again, do a quick sanity check. That looks fine, that looks good, good, and good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the same thing, but we're going to do it with the bent pipe. So go to File, Save, and save this away at the proper location. So normally I would have a substance folder, painter, and then I would call this pipe 2 underscore 2, and I might just leave it at that. Now I did say we'd have multiple variations, so let's just do that really fast. Is I'm going to take everything here, grab it, make a folder, and I'm going to call this pipe 2 wastewater. Grab it all, stick it inside, right click on it, and choose Create Smart Material. Now, in your Smart Material section, over here, what you'll see is the name of that particular group right there, and it's going to save all of those settings. So now we could Control C and Control V this. Now we have the same thing, but I could call this wastewater green, or let's not even do wastewater. Let's create the other variations. What was it? We had gray, red, and yellow. So we'll do red and yellow. Now turn off those other layers when you're not using them. Come over to red, open it up, go to your cast iron layer, and actually go to your painted layer. That's on top of everything, and choose that to the color you want. So here we're choosing red with a brighter red. And if you want to, go to your paint layer and of course change that color, and maybe we'll choose a yellow for this portion. Of course, I want to choose a yellow that makes more sense. Maybe a very bright white. We'll do that. And let's go to File, Export Textures. Once again, we'll choose Red Hot Water, select folder. I'm going to save that because I do want to go to my texture set settings. And actually, since it's supposed to be hot water, we should really go back down to this layer, paint over this, getting rid of this portion here. Now we just need to change the name. So coming down here, just call this hot water. Changes the texture space, and just get this somewhat like it probably was. So this should probably be bold as well. And we might want to actually go to white. And of course, turn off angle, position, and all these other things. Paste that in there. The more I see that, the more I hate that color. So why don't we switch that really fast? Then on this one, we could come back to paint if we wanted to, and pick some sort of a brush like this one, maybe this one down here. And we can choose to paint black, for instance. And we can just start to kind of rip away at different parts of this. And take your time, make it maybe a different kind of looking damage. Maybe this should be coming from the top instead. Definitely should have a lot of angle jitter as well, but this actually just dissolves kind of nice. You can do some interesting stuff with this. There's been some water damage coming from down there. Check our texture set settings, File, Export Textures. That's correct. This is all correct. Hit Export. Now we're done with that object. Let's make another one of these. We'll do yellow flammable. Come back over here to yellow flammable now. Turn that one on. Open it up, and we'll go to steel painted and change this to maybe not yellow, maybe orange. And on this one, we will make the text black, I think. So move this down here. And I'm really not liking how that looks, so I'm just going to get a whole new go at this for this one. And we will go to our alphas, and I'll choose some kind of text. Now this one's flammable, so maybe I should use a different font, or maybe we should use a different language and make this one really interesting. And we will type in flammable danger. Let's copy these and see if this works. It does work, great. And we will then put this on the pipe. And we'll of course get rid of all those random things. There we are. There we are. And now of course we can go on top of this, add a fill layer for instance. In the fill layer, take the grunge map, put in anything at this point, and turn this to something else. We can just make this a multiply layer. Right click on the layer, add levels to it, and try to push things in one direction or the other. There we go. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Then I could add a second levels on top of that so I can see the levels below it. And then you can start playing with different things. Like here I'm trying to push it further so we get nice bits of the paint removed. Okay, now I can go to File, Export Textures, and we'll go to Yellow Flammable. Hit Export, and there it is. What you're going to see after this now is I'm going to be quiet, and it's going to be the same process, but this time with that curved piece.